Mr. President, thank you. We would like to know what kind of president you will be now that the job is yours officially. Let's use world leaders as a comparison. Is there a president, a prime minister, or perhaps another head of state whom you admire, whom you consider an example to follow?
Olha, no Brasil, eu tenho como exemplo.
Well, in Brazil, I have as example our former president, Juscelino Kubitschek. He was a very active president, very pro-modernity in terms of the Brazilian agenda, and also it was a happy administration. My role, as you know, I will only have 2 years and 4 months in government, and so my role will consist in putting Brazil back in track. That's all I want. We assumed or took office at a time where the country was in a very poor and significantly bad economic situation. We want to, of course, increasingly improve the deficit and generate job opportunities and growth for the nation.
Mr. President, you want to cap spending, government spending, in real terms, as well as make Social Security, call it more restrictive. These are two ambitious proposals that both require constitutional change, and they are not without opposition. So let us talk about timing, a timeline, if you will. Realistically, when will these two important reforms be passed into law?
Olha, são duas reformas difíceis, eu reconheço.
These are two difficult reforms, I acknowledge that, but they are essential. And precisely because they are essential, I believe that we will pass these issues or subject matters in Congress. And the time required, more precisely regarding measures to cap government spending, as you know, we are setting a ceiling to government spending that may be renewed in every budget year based on the previous year's inflation. So in that regard, I am absolutely certain that we will be able to pass that measure before the end of this year. The other reform is the Social Security/pension reform, which will be submitted to Congress this year, but will certainly be passed next year, first half of next year. That is more or less the timeline that is required for these two bills to be passed. If I may, I'd like to refer to yet another reform, a third reform, labor reform, to ensure jobs are available, a matter that has actually been addressed by the Brazilian Supreme Court. And several of the proposals I have put forth so far, one of them actually is about ensuring prevalence of collective agreements established between workers and employers based on the provisions of the law. The Federal Supreme Court has already made a decision or issued a ruling in that regard. So again, these are issues that are absolutely essential. These measures are absolutely essential, and there's a great degree of understanding on the part of both the Brazilian Congress and also the Brazilian people at large about those needs.
Essential, but as you acknowledge, difficult. So I would like to know, what compromises, allowances, if you will, are you prepared to make to ensure that the budget bill or the spending bill gets passed this year, as you say, and that the Social Security reform bill will be passed next year?
Nós temos cronograma.
We have a timetable, and I'm going to talk about it with great peace of mind. I mean, the timeline we have regarding government spending, or the ceiling to government spending, the target date is October the 3rd or the 18th at the latest, as part of the work of a special committee in the lower house of Parliament. And only later, before the end of the year, will the matter be forwarded to a plenary session in the lower house of Parliament for approval before the end of October, November. And then it will be sent on to Congress or to Senate, and Senate will have about 1.5 months to pass the bill. So I believe that the current outlook in government is that no later than December 15th or 18th we should have passed the ceiling to government spending. And again, regarding pension reform, we're going to submit it to Congress this year. It involves a proposed constitutional amendment, as you yourself indicated. So yes, it does require that proper procedures be followed in Congress, which may take more time. But before the end of the year, we will certainly have covered those measures.
The reason I ask about compromises is because many Brazilians say the government isn't spending enough on education, the government isn't spending enough on health care. And if you cap spending, that means unless you take it from somewhere else, you won't be able to spend more on health care, and you won't be able to spend more on schools.
Mas isso é digamos assim, argumento oposicionista.
Yeah, but that is
Matéria do teto de gastos.
an argument very often used by the opposition, because if you read the contents of the bill, you will see that the nature is of an overall nature. In other words, or the ceiling is of an overall nature. There's an overall ceiling to all government spending without any reduction in education and healthcare, for instance. For the budget, the 2017 budget, we have already applied the ceiling as if the proposed constitutional amendment had already been passed. And unlike what is said, we have increased the budget appropriations for health and education. These two sectors will not at all be somehow harmed by the constitutional ceiling.
Mr. President, how long is it going to take to close the budget deficit? How many years? Because I think it has to be years before Brazil has a primary surplus.
É verdade, nós apanhamos o governo com déficit de
That's true. We took office and we found a deficit of 270 billion Brazilian reals and 500 million. We have already established measures to reduce the deficit to 130 billion Brazilian reals, and I believe that in 2018 we will still have to live with a small deficit. But all of that, of course, is the result of fiscal and economic policy aimed at lowering inflation. There is also a trend that we will reach the center of the inflation target, which is about 4.5% for next year. And as I said before, we also want to, of course, create many jobs. And I confirm what you just stated. Yes, it will be 2-3 years, perhaps, before we totally eliminate the deficit. I agree. But I must say that some time ago, not too long ago, I got this very telling research finding indicating that if we had set this spending ceiling 4 years ago, by this time we would have no deficit whatsoever in Brazil anymore.
Mr. President, the support you relied on for Dilma's impeachment in Congress is fragile, let's say. The Brazilian people themselves aren't in love with the idea of austerity. How do you maintain the momentum for the bold reforms that you've announced over the past 4 months during your term as interim president, the very same reforms domestic business people and foreign investors are counting on to revive the economy? How do you maintain that momentum?
Olha, em primeiro lugar, você disse bem, nós...
Well, first of all, you put it very well. During our interim period in office, we took a number of different measures, one of which was, of course, to send Congress a proposal governing a ceiling to government spending. A second measure we took was to do with the public-private partnerships. We have just recently launched a broad program, and I'm now in New York. And while in New York, I will be talking about U.S.-based investors the day after tomorrow with a view to ensuring more foreign investments flow into Brazil, of course, very much in line and in tandem with domestic investments, where and whenever possible. Now, with these recent announcements, we are opening up for public concessions about 34 different lines of business, including ports, airports, railways, oil and gas industry opportunities, etc. So we are totally changing the business climate in the country. Furthermore, may I state for the record that there has been a tremendous resumption of confidence or trust. First, we were able to reestablish hope, and now we are managing to successfully reestablish trust, which will, of course, trigger not only an inflow of more investments, and of course there's some degree of resistance to innovation at times. It all depends to a certain extent on the way we are able to communicate or on the way we are able to properly explain the proposed reforms. And at this point in time, we already see Brazilians, the Brazilian population, beginning to understand that these reforms are absolutely key and essential to recover, resume hope and trust in the country.
Mr. President, let's talk about Operation Car Wash, Lava Jato, the investigation into corruption in and around Petrobras. Is it a simple matter of black and white? The more corruption the investigation exposes, the better? Or is it more shaded, more complex, if you will? Is there a point at which the investigation becomes counterproductive, maybe even destabilizing?
Olha, Você sabe que lá há uma certa divisão em torno dessa matéria.
You know that there is some division around this issue. Some people seem to think there has been some exaggeration, but those of us who are in the executive, we do not at all meddle with it, especially the judiciary, nor do we interfere with matters that are addressed in Brazil by the Federal Public Prosecutor's Office and by federal judges. There is no interference whatsoever on the part of the executive in these matters, and that is precisely what provides institutional stability in Brazil, as has by extension been likewise the case during the impeachment process of the previous administration. It was a process that was regularly conducted by the legislative with proper monitoring and follow-up by the judiciary. So yes, institutions in Brazil are working very well and properly. The car wash operation, the car wash investigation, for example, will continue until such time as all illegal actions may have been looked into.
Even if it continues to expose allegations of corruption within your own party at the highest levels?
Sem problema nenhum.
Yes, no problem whatsoever, because what has happened, in fact, you used a very important or appropriate phrase. There have been allegations only. What does that mean? Well, someone may enter into a testimonial plea bargaining agreement and refers to one or two politicians. So the irregular process is fully underway. So that means that you have, first of all, of course, an investigation following an inquiry, and then, of course, you have an indictment followed by a discussion in the judiciary before a sentence is issued. So Brazil will face up to this question very much in peace of mind.
Mr. President, I would like to know how far you're willing to go to end corruption in Brazil. Would you end immunity from prosecution for lawmakers and senior government officials?
Olha, já fizemos isso. Você sabe que...
You know, we have done that already. Very recently, I sanctioned a bill of law providing for, say, a greater sense of morality, if you understand me, in appointment of persons to hold key positions, such as directors in state-owned corporations, for example, which does not mean that the political class cannot possibly appoint persons, but the fact is that they cannot possibly appoint political people, but only technical experts, people who have some experience and exposure in addressing the matters that are part of the agenda of that given state-owned corporation or public entity. So this has been established for good as a result of my sanctioning a recent bill of law while in office as an interim president.
But does that address the question of immunity from prosecution for elected representatives, for lawmakers?
Bom, a questão da imunidade parlamentar...
The question of, say, congressional or parliamentarian immunity, that is something we will not change, because immunity by virtue of reasons, opinions, and votes has been a traditional form of immunity in the Brazilian law domestically, as has always been the case here in the United States. Now, as regards the potential for a criminal action being perpetrated, of course, not even members of Congress are at all protected from any criminal procedures. And actually, this kind of procedure is underway in Brazil in many cases.
Mr. President, I thank you very much for your time.
Eu que agradeço.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.